Good morning, Professor Dennehy. I'm very happy that you're my guest, and thank you for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I would like to start with with a story about your education, your academic path, since you have a very impressive biography. So could you share a bit about your academic journey and what inspired you to specialize in both law and history? I would like to know how your educational days looked like back then when you were a student at high school, and just a little background check.
So I grew up in a town called Killarney in County Kerry, which is in the southwest of Ireland. And I just went to the local elementary school or primary school. And most of the schools in Ireland tend to have a religious input. And it was quite interesting that my school was actually named after St. Oliver Plunkett, who's somebody who I study later on in the 17th century. He's a martyr. He's executed in England during the very early 1680s. Not that I took much notice of him at the time. And my primary education was pretty standard and pretty happy. When I was 12 years old, my father's job moved from the southwest of Ireland to the east coast to the capital in Dublin. So I moved up and I began secondary school, which in Ireland you begin at about the age of 12. And again, that was just the local called a community school, and it taught everything. It was a very good school, looking back on it. And they taught everything from very practical subjects like woodwork and metalwork and engineering, and also lots of academic subjects. And school I enjoyed. I'm not sure if I was very good at it necessarily. I didn't fail my final exams, but I didn't do well enough to attend university in the course that I wanted, because I had chosen subjects like chemistry, which I was not very good at. I had taken German, which I found okay. So when I repeated my exams, I dropped chemistry. I took up what was called home economics, which was a subject at the time which people generally said was a subject for girls because it was cooking and things like that. But I loved it, and I love cooking still. And so I did okay in that test. And the second attempt, I got into university. And I suppose in terms of my academic interests in school, I always loved history. I think my father liked history a lot. So when we were young, we'd have talked a bit about history, and we visited history sites. We had cousins who lived in London, so we went on holidays once to London, and I went to a place called the Imperial War Museum, which is a very prominent museum in London. And the scale of it was just superior to any museum we'd have had in Ireland. And they had fighter airplanes hanging from the ceilings, and they had tanks that you could get into. And when you're an 8-year-old boy, that's very, very cool. And it still is kind of cool, I suppose. And so I loved kind of military history of 20th century conflict and stuff like that. And just because that's what, when you pick up a comic book or books, you can kind of easily get a hold of. And so I kind of always had an interest in history, and I was generally good at history. But my exam results were never that spectacular in history in high school. So I was good, I could talk, I could engage with the teacher. It was frequently the case that I felt that I had a grasp on certain things that other people in the class wouldn't have done. And I think he recognized that. He was a very good teacher, actually, a guy called Tony Brady, and a previous teacher called Dennis Finn, also excellent. But writing history or writing it in the way that the examiners wanted me to write it wasn't something I was particularly good at. But I suppose I was determined from that point to study history. And I think when I first entered university, back in the last century, it makes me sound very old now, in 1996, I entered university. And in the Irish system, when you go to study arts or humanities, as they might be called, you generally, the vast majority of Irish students will take 2 subjects. So the way it worked in University College Dublin, where I was studying, was you started taking 3 subjects, and then you usually dropped one of them. So I started taking a history, which was always the first one. English, because I found I was good at it, and I enjoyed it reasonably well. And it works well with history because we write a lot in history in Ireland, so it complements it. And then also Celtic civilization, which is a little bit more niche. And it was a mixture of Celtic archaeology. Ireland is a Celtic country, and it's a very prominent part of its identity. And so we spent a lot of time just looking at Celtic history, Celtic archaeology, early history of Ireland, by which I mean 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, and then some things on early Celtic literature, mythology, that sort of thing. At the end of my first year, I did reasonably well in my first year exams in university because I think it's approached differently to the way high school history is. So I found I was kind of getting into my groove in university in ways that maybe I didn't in secondary school. And so from there, then I did well in those first year exams. And so I was invited, or I had the opportunity to take history just by itself, not with another subject. And it was a small group, a kind of a little niche group of people studying history by themselves. And it was very good because it was a vigorous education then, because it was purely in history. So I think one of the values of doing history with other subjects I think it was something highlighted by a man called John Henry Newman, who's just been recently made a Catholic saint. He's the man who founded, he was an English scholar who converted to Catholicism, and he came to Dublin to set up the university in the mid-19th century. And one of the things he valued was a wide spread of education. And I think the university that I studied in, University College Dublin, still provides that. And I have very happy memories of that university. So the syllabus, as it was thought back then, and I think it's similar now, roughly has we teach things like classics and archaeology quite separately from history. So history in Ireland generally starts around about the mid-5th century, when Christianity begins to emerge. And we have the official year in the past of the arrival of Christianity was with St. Patrick in 432. We know that there was Christians in Ireland before this point. But from around this mid-5th century period, Christianity takes off, and it's not necessarily the case that Christianity means we have history all of a sudden, but it does emerge in Ireland that we have a written sources beginning to emerge, because the Irish people, they have forms of writing called ogham, which is kind of notches on upright stones that can mark boundaries and things like that, and actually provides for useful legal markers of property in a very, very early sense. But it also allows us to get the emergence of very early forms of vernacular literature emerging. Ireland has some of the earliest forms of vernacular literature outside of Roman or Greek, So it's a very interesting sort of an area. The history syllabus spreads roughly half Irish history and roughly half elsewhere. And we had some very good scholars from Europe working in the university at the time on France, on Italy. Became particularly interested in early modern history, but in the early days I was just thinking I might become a secondary school teacher. I didn't really have ambitions towards academia, but once I got into university I really started to enjoy it, and when I started studying history by itself, I was essentially getting a double hit of history each semester, which was great. So I covered lots of areas of medieval, very modern, faraway places from Ireland, lots of Irish history as well. And I suppose in particular, when I came towards my third year, the final year of our degree, we have a 3-year history degree. We had to write a dissertation, a small thesis, a special study, where we would actually undertake some kind of attempt to take some real research, read real documents, either in print form or even potentially in manuscript form as well, and to try and make something of a topic. And I was searching around for a topic, and I was being taught in second year by a man called James Maguire, who was a brilliant historian, and he was in many ways he facilitated lots of other people's great work because he had edited a lot of important journals, and in particular he was an editor of a huge project called the Dictionary of Irish Biography, which is I think it's about 11 volumes now of biographical entries of anybody who's important in Irish history, and it's online now and it's freely available. I think the address is dib.ie, but it was a huge project that took a huge part of his career. And James had an uncanny knack, a number of people had commented, of finding the right topic for the right student. And it's not a talent that every supervisor has, but he had it, I think, in abundance, that he just had a good sense of what you were able for and what you thrive in. And I initially went to him. I'd been studying 17th and 18th century Protestant culture in Ireland as a module. And I just read somewhere in a book, I think it was by Sean Connolly, a mention of church courts, which in Ireland, most of the things that had been traditionally part of canon law had switched over to the secular state. But one thing that had been left behind were what essentially we might call morality issues now. And I was kind of interested in this because there's always interesting stories about people who are moral or immoral and their behaviour and what society expects of them. And so that link between court and law, but also things like marriage, family, sexuality, gender, all those sort of things I was curious about. And I went to him and he sort of said, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But looking back on it now, I think the sources were difficult. A lot of material was in Latin. I didn't have Latin. So he kind of skillfully managed to maneuver me from wanting to do church courts to instead sort of saying, well, parliamentary history is actually really interesting these days, and there's lots of interesting things happening. Have you thought about maybe studying the Irish Parliament? So I walked into his office saying, I want to study church courts, and I walked out saying, I want to study Parliament. And so I wrote a dissertation on issues surrounding kind of anxiety around a land settlement law in the mid-1660s in Ireland, and I enjoyed it. And so then when I finished the degree, I went back to him and said, I'd like to study postgraduate work, and I'd like to do it with you. And he kindly accepted me as a student of his, and it was a 2-year degree, a research master's. And it was just on a parliament that sat between 1661 and 1666. And James was, I probably didn't realize it at the time, but his supervisor, he had studied at Cambridge, and his PhD supervisor was a man called Geoffrey Elton, who wrote mostly English history, mostly parliamentary history, but his own personal history is actually Central European, because he had been, I think if I'm not mistaken, he had left what was the Sudetenland in Czech, what we now call the Czech Republic, and had to leave there because he was Jewish, and he ended up in England. He's actually an uncle of a prominent comedian called Ben Elton. If you've ever seen, there's a very good comedy that's in England. We watch it in Ireland a lot, called Blackadder. I don't know if it's prominent in Serbia. There's one set during World War I, and it's his nephew who's the author on that comedy. But he was a very, very good historian. But he had a very strong personality, and he was very firm on the idea of that there probably was no kind of concerted opposition in the period that he was writing on, and instead he suggested that's what really interesting in parliamentary history is procedure. And from here, I suppose I went from being a historian working primarily on Parliament in my own head to then becoming instead a historian who was working on legal procedure. Because in Ireland, I don't know if it's the same in the Balkans, but in Ireland, the Parliament is also the Supreme Court. The House of Lords, the upper House of Parliament, is also the Supreme Court. So they hear a huge number of cases. So not only are they creating law through legislation, but they're also judging law through cases that come before the court. So the House of Lords, which is made up of aristocrats, they're not lawyers by any means, but they sit as both judge and jury in a lot of these cases. And Parliament's a really interesting forum, I think, to study legal history, because it allows us, there's lots of lawyers in the lower house, as is still the case in lots of parliaments around the world. So it's an interesting forum. It's not a court, but it is an interesting forum for lawyers to gather to talk about law in lots of ways. So it's kind of an interesting way in that regard. So after my master's, sorry, this is a long story now.
Yeah,
After the master's, I stayed in University College Dublin, and I took a long time to do my PhD, far longer than I would appreciate a student of mine doing now. Mine took about 8 or 9 years. Standard at the time, it was officially 3, but most people did maybe 3.5 years or something like that. But I was working in between, and I'd published a decent amount of material during the course of my PhD. And I'd done teaching in other universities. And so my excuse, at least, I don't know if it's a viable excuse, my excuse is that I was busy doing other things when I should have been doing my PhD. But I firmly believe that a long PhD can be a brilliant way to do a PhD, because if we rush it sometimes, particularly when people receive funding to do a PhD, there's the urge from the funding body to ensure that the work is completed in 3 years. But sometimes, as I'm sure you know or your colleagues would know, sometimes a project takes longer. You can't always find a good dissertation that's writable in 3 years. And sometimes if it takes 5, it's worth it. I always say a slow-cooked stew tastes much, much better rather than fast cooking, and it's the same sometimes with research. Sometimes you have to give extra time and allow it to break down and to really understand what's going on. So the PhD I worked on then on Irish parliaments generally in the 17th century, but I was concentrating exclusively on the legal functions of Parliament. So I was not interested in parliamentary politics. I wasn't necessarily interested in any of the people who sat in Parliament. I wasn't interested in biography of members. I was literally interested in how the Houses and the Parliament generally, it's a bicameral Parliament in Ireland, so there's a House of Commons, which represents the town and the gentry class of the rural areas, and then the House of Lords, which represents the aristocracy and also the bishops. And so I was really interested in the sort of administrative and legal history of Parliament, how it works, how bills are processed through the House, how petitions are heard from the people, how the houses interact with each other, because people have ambitions within their house, and we often talk about the rise of the House of Commons taking over, the rise of the middle classes taking over from the aristocracy, and how they interact then with the royal prerogative and the royal personality in Dublin. The king doesn't live in Dublin, he's always in London, because Ireland for the most part is part of the English royal system at this point, but there is a representative who lives and stays in Dublin. And so how they all react and interact was very interesting to me. And my supervisor at that point was a fellow called John McCafferty, who I'm still very friendly with, as I'm with my other supervisor as well. Lots of people fall out with the supervisors, it's not uncommon. I was very lucky with both of mine. And he wrote a lot of sort of religious history, but he was very strong on politics and law as well. And he had trained also at Cambridge under a guy called John Morrell. And I think German historians often talk of, I can't remember the exact phrase they use, something like I think the English equivalent is something like your doctoral grandfather, that primarily your work is your own, but you're always going to be influenced by your supervisor, just like a child is influenced by their parents, but also maybe by your grandparents as well. And so I think I've probably gained a little bit, and I know John Morrell a little bit as well, and he's a fantastic historian, and I've read material, and sometimes that's a very useful influence over your career. So I was very lucky in terms of all the supervisors, and John was excellent because he knew I'd done a considerable amount of research already. Working with a previous supervisor, I'd already done research, so he was willing to let me off the lead, so to speak, and so I could go and study what I wanted and read what I wanted, and he didn't kind of nag or pursue me too much. But when I came to him with problems or with issues, or when I had writing that I wanted read, he was always very quick to react. So it was a very, for me at least, it was a very happy relationship. I'm sure there were times where he wondered would it ever finish, but eventually it did. And so that takes me up to PhD level. And when I finished the PhD, it was about 2 years after the economic crash of 2008. So not a good time to be emerging into the world looking for employment, especially in such a niche area. And I had been doing work with another company kind of on the side whilst I was studying, and that company had collapsed, and I got a payment as a goodbye, you're not working with us anymore payment. And I was bored and I had nothing else to do, and I was always curious about the law, so I decided then to engage in a Master's of Law, also at University College Dublin, particularly in criminology. And this was different. It was criminology for me, it was taught within the law school in UCD, but criminology to me is essentially looking at things like sociology and psychology and even economics. And there is some law in it. We didn't actually study much law at all within it, but the practical application of how the law works and the human consequences of people who fall foul of the criminal justice system, people who are victims of crime or survivors of crime, people who perpetuate crime, and then how the administration of a system works with things like prison and paroles and stuff like that. I just found absolutely fascinating. So I did something very different, even though it sounds like legal history, then studying criminology within a law context. That doesn't sound too radical, but I left the early modern period behind and I started studying what was an important contemporary issue at the time. I was looking at the Irish sex industry, so things like prostitution and brothel keeping and the law, and particularly the human consequences of how laws are created around these things, but essentially can be a very private issue. Nobody wants the state interfering in their private life to that point, even though it does sometimes in some countries around things like abortion or contraception or things like that. But also there was a feeling within Ireland at the time, and I think a law that was created around the criminalisation of that, of large parts of that industry. I don't think it's necessarily worked well since then. But the research I was doing felt like it was quite relevant at the time, more so maybe than legal history, because it was something that was actually happening. So I was a criminologist doing sort of investigations into the sociology of sex work and things like that. So it was very useful to think about law from an entirely different perspective. If we're studying the history of law in one corner of the room, doing a criminology degree is like going out the door and going to the far end of the building, and you see things from a very different perspective. And it's really healthy, I think, for academics. Say for me, I came from a very humanities-based background, to then go and see how law works, and then go and see how the sociology of crime works. And you pick up different skills and different insights from different branches of academia. And so what I'm trying to do now is to try and gather all of these different strands and try and become a better academic, taking all of the best ideas from criminology, from law, from history and things like that, And at some point I have ambitions to do, I'm currently working just a very practical master's on education because the thing about academia, I don't know if it's the same in Serbia, but one of the things about academia is that we gather all of these, these very clever people into buildings, into universities, where primarily it's about teaching young people, but we're never trained to teach. We're good on history or law or whatever else it is, but we never actually learn how to teach well. Now, some lecturers have a brilliant knack and they're just naturally talented. Others don't. So what I'm trying to do, because my employer, Dundalk Institute of Technology, very kindly encourage us and pay the fees to go and study. So it's brilliant. So why wouldn't I? But after that, I think maybe if time allows, at some point, I'd probably like to study theology. Because again, it will bring me another insight into ideas around how these things work,
Hey, Roger, I will bring you another perspective. So, in which exact moment do you know that you made the right choice when it comes to your career? Because you told me about various areas of interest, and you have been influenced by some, let's say, important people at the time. Professors, authors. So I would like to know when exactly, in which moment you knew that you made the right choice when it comes to career pick.
It's a tricky one actually, because like I say, when I finished my PhD, the employment prospects were not good. I was very lucky in that after I finished my studies in criminology, I was very, very lucky to be awarded a Marie Curie Skłodowska, I can never pronounce the last part of her surname, award by the European Research Council. And that was a chance to go to London for 2 years and to spend another few years back in Ireland, all paid for by the European Research Council with a very generous research grant. And I think I used it well. I published a lot out of it. I got a lot of time to research different projects. But even after that, again, the nature of employment in the academic sector, and I think this is the same across Europe, is that we produce more postgraduates than we do jobs available in academia. Now, postgraduate anything is a brilliant training in itself, I would say. But I would always say to students, whilst I'd love to have you come and study postgraduate with me, and I think it's a brilliant way to help develop people, to help develop their critical thinking and things like that, there's never guarantees of employment. So in the practical sense, until I got a permanent job, I was never sure that I'd taken the right decision to study. But aside from the practicalities of having employment and being able to pay rent and all that sort of thing, I think I was always confident that I was doing the right thing for me, purely from a sort of a personal development or an intellectual development kind of perspective. I always kind of felt that my research was interesting because it was interesting to me, so therefore I consider it to be interesting, that I was engaged with it, that I enjoyed doing it. I suppose we often wonder, does it contribute anything to the academy generally, because we can become so wrapped up in our personal sort of projects. And because if it's the only thing you're studying, you're constantly thinking this is the center of the world, because for me, for the next 2 years, it is, and it's all I'm thinking about. And you become so wrapped up in it. And sometimes it's important to step back and say, actually, is this important? Is this contributing something useful? Sometimes studies are undertaken, or articles are written, or sometimes even books are written. And it's fair to ask, does this actually help the world? Does it make our intellectual horizon any brighter? Does it help contribute anything? When I was studying in London, there was a senior professor in our department called Margot Finn, who worked on 17th century India, and she had a brilliant phrase at seminars where students, and it wasn't rude, or it wasn't meant to be rude, but her automatic question kind of a lot of the time was, so what? Somebody's done a paper on some random aspect of the past, and she legitimately would ask, so what? Why is this relevant? Why is this special? Why is this worth researching? Why is this worth spending a year or two of your time engaging in this? And if you as a student can't answer so what with a positive outcome, then it's fair to ask, is there a need to do this? Because sometimes you'd see random studies that are conducted which disappear. They don't make any real impact. And sometimes that's just the unfortunate nature of fashions and trends within academia. Sometimes things are popular, they fall out of popularity. I think it's cyclical. I always say to students, I think it's kind of like flared trousers, very popular in the 1970s, came back again in the 1990s, out of popularity now. And history sometimes is the same. So in Ireland, for instance, when I was going to college in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, military history was not popular at all. A handful of people thought it, but not many. And now I think 2 or 3 of the universities, prominent universities, all have centres for military history. And that was it was seen, military history was old. One regiment marches here and they wear these sort of uniforms with these sort of buttons and badges, and it was not seen as anything, not in any way fashionable or useful, whereas now lots of people are studying and lots of people are getting funding for it. So I think sometimes legal history or parliamentary history may be in the same vein, that things come in and out of fashion. And I think when I was doing parliamentary history, to a point, it seemed like it was not particularly fashionable, because I was studying an institution, not people. I was studying systems of administrative control and governance and things like that. And I was purposefully trying to keep people out of my history. Even though these systems obviously are staffed by people and they're created by people and they're for the benefit of people or to the detriment of people. But ultimately I wasn't studying people, I was studying a system, and for me that kind of advantage. So I suppose a long way of coming back to your original question is, practically, I was never sure that I'd made a good decision to study history or to study as a PhD, although now I'm very happy with it. Intellectually, I suppose I was always maybe overconfident or maybe misplaced confident that my work was useful or helpful. But for me, at least in the way I study, and I know there's other historians who take the same approach that I do, and I think we're all fairly assured that our work is useful, or that we think it makes a contribution, But only time will tell.
I agree. So you didn't focus, as you said, on the persons or on the structure when it comes to people. You primarily researched institutions, but interdisciplinary path naturally have opened some political questions, authorities, and I would like to know what drew you specifically in that context to study especially the representative and parliamentary institutions. And during that time, did you have any favorite historical person who you found influenced at the time?
Right. So do you mean somebody from the 17th century or a historian from I was reading?
From your research period.
Okay. So I suppose to go back to starting my master's studies, that's where I started first looking at Parliament. The dissertation that I wrote was sort of half on parliamentary politics and the other half was on how Parliament worked, because my supervisor at the time said, a lot of people who study politics in the 17th century, they kind of understand how politics works, but they don't always understand how the institutions of the state work. And sometimes there can be confusion between what people assume is maybe a manifestation of political intrigue or political disruption can in fact be a normal administrative piece of work. But if you don't understand the administrative side of the institution, you may not understand aspects of the political. So we can help political historians by explaining how things like courts and parliaments work, and thereby creating a better understanding of the past. And so that's the kind of material I was sort of looking at. Like I said, there have been a few historians, people like Geoffrey Elton or Michael Graves, who had been doing very interesting work on those practical sides of Parliament. And Elizabeth Reid Foster, I think was her name as well, did a brilliant book on the House of Lords. And so I enjoyed approaching that from that sort of perspective. Is there any historical figure that I find interesting? There's a few. The Speaker of the Irish House of Commons went on a very peculiar sort of political journey, and he's not a very likable sort of a figure, but I sometimes think they're sometimes the more interesting ones. Ireland is in the midst of a colonial project. The Gaelic Irish, the kind of what we might call something like the original inhabitants of Ireland, are added to in the 12th century in the kind of 9th century by Viking invaders who settled particularly in cities around the coast. Later on then in the 12th century by Norman invaders basically coming from England, maybe originally from France and 2 generations later from England. And then in the 16th and the 17th century by more English colonizers or planters who are distinctly Protestant as opposed to the population of Ireland who remain quite Catholic. So in the 17th century you have this kind of battle for supremacy for people who will be employed within government, who will have control of local government, control of national government, people who control the Irish Parliament. It's exclusively Catholic in the mid-16th century, but yet by 1613, the lower House of Commons has got a Protestant majority. By 1661, it's entirely Protestant, 100%. And then a few decades later, Parliament is exclusively Protestant as a result. And Parliament can be used there as a way of seeing the colonial project in action, of the replacement of one elite with the other. That's essentially what colonization is in some ways. It's the replacements of elites, because we know that other things like a replacement of religion, which is attempted but never successfully completed because most of Ireland remains Catholic today, or things like language, or what the English term civilization. And this can include things like the clothes that people wear, like the replacement. I'm sure it's the same in the Balkans as people come from different corners of the area, whether it's from Turkey or from the north, from the east. They have different ideas of what civilization is. And this can be based around your languages you speak, the way that you worship, the way that you dress. In Ireland, people become obsessed with moustaches. The law actually is promulgated to stop people wearing hair and facial hair in certain ways, because one side is seen as being distinctly Irish and one side is seen as distinctly not. So this character in the House of Commons, for instance, is a figure who is a colonizer, and he's just got a very interesting history in how he's involved and how he becomes the Speaker of the House of Lords, which is a prominent political position, even though he's not necessarily popular with many other people. Or there's another figure who, again, he's not a very nice man. Most of the people I like tend not to be very nice. Is a judge in the 17th century, and his name is Jerome Alexander, and I suppose he's an absolute rascal. He's a rascal, a man of very low personal morals. So he is actually disbarred from practice in England. He's a lawyer in England, and he's disbarred. He's kicked out of the profession because he's been forging documents, which is, for lawyers, absolutely as bad as it gets, pretty much. And he's promoting these documents. I think it's in a case that he's pleading on his own behalf, where documents are forged, and he's kicked out of the profession in England. So absolutely a persona non gratis in England. And this, to my mind, says everything that's of interest in the colonial project. So if you're unpopular in England, you've been thrown out of your legal profession, you're disgraced. What's he going to do? He comes to Ireland, he sets up a practice, and within a few years he's made a judge. And he becomes a judge in the courts. On his appointment as judge in the very early 1660s, he's in an argument with another judge over precedence, over who gets to walk first in a procession and things like that. And he challenges his brother judge to a duel. He gets a glove and slaps him, and he wants to fight. The fight never happens, but again, for a legal professional to be doing this, and he's just such a contrary, angry man. He's known as a hanging judge, so he's sent on circuit. In Ireland, we have a circuit system. So for the criminal courts, the local cases of not great importance are dealt with locally, but then for more important cases like murder, rape, significant theft, stuff like that, judges go out on circuit. So they travel around the countryside and they hold courts in all of the local administrative areas of Ireland. And so he's sent out in areas where there's trouble because they know he'll be quite a firm. He's I suppose today we would call him a reactionary judge. He believes in harsh punishment a lot of the time. So he's known as a hanging judge. But then one of the most interesting things, I think, is we have his will, which we don't always have. And he leaves his books to Trinity College Dublin. They're delighted to get them. And he leaves some money for the poor Protestants of Dublin, which is not untypical at the time. But he leaves everything. He has no sons, so he leaves everything to his daughters on condition that they don't marry anybody from the island of Ireland, Protestant or Catholic. So he comes to Ireland. He's a judge here, but he hates the Irish. And he hates everybody from Ireland, whether they're Protestant or Catholic. So again, he's almost like a cartoon character. He's like a bad guy in a film, you know. And I find him interesting because I suppose he's different, because he doesn't conform to what everybody else is doing in society. So I always keep an eye out for him in various sources where if I see the name, I'll always write it down, because at some time maybe I'll come back and write something on him, because he's interesting, because he's fun. He's not a nice person, though. I wouldn't want him to be my friend. You know, but he is interesting to read because he's so different from everybody else.
Yes, he is not an ordinary person. So, as you can see, societies and the legal systems are very connected. So here comes my next question. What insights can the study of crime and punishments overall provide into our knowledge about the structure and the values of past societies?
Oh, I think it's brilliant. I think it's so useful to look at. So, I mean, you can study the values of societies and the ideas of societies through a number of ways, through religion, through economics, through all sorts of things. The very valuable aspect of crime, I suppose, is that it's a study of society and individuals' reactions to events when they're at their most stressful. Do you know? The moment in your life, if you're a victim or if you're a perpetrator of a very serious crime, for example, like say a murder, you will never forget that. Do you know? And also it shows humans at, I suppose, the moment of their most crisis. And this is 21st century or 17th century. It's still the same, I think. And the reactions to those harms that have been done to them tell us an awful lot. So the talk that I'm going to be giving later on today will be looking at a system of criminal justice that allows for very high levels of execution. We break down law in Ireland, as in the common law system generally, with kind of three categories of law. On the top we have treason, offences against the state, offences against the king, killing a diplomat, killing a monarch, somebody very important, very serious crime, very serious punishment. On the bottom level, we have what we might call misdemeanors, which are relatively lighter crimes with relatively lighter punishments, which could be a corporal punishment, like a whipping, or maybe some sort of damage to the body, to the ears or the nose or something like that, or simply just a fine, or even simply humiliation, shame punishments. And the in-between ones are called felonies, and the felonies almost all have death as the sentence. And so this can be literally for stealing anything from 12 worth of 12 pence up. So relatively speaking, not a huge amount of wealth, or things like mostly theft, crimes against property and stuff like that. So whilst the law allows for, in theory, huge numbers of criminals to be executed, the records suggest, as far as I can see at least, that the levels of people being killed are actually relatively small. That we might have, so for instance, I'll have a PowerPoint for the talk, which shows some results from trials. And in one place in County Tipperary in the Midlands of Ireland, fairly typical sort of an area, we might have potentially, I think in one section, I have about 232 people who come before the court. In theory, all of them are for felonies. So they could all, for felonies or treasons. So they could all, in theory, if found guilty, be hanged. One person is sentenced to death, and I'm not even sure if that sentence is carried out. So what I'm saying is, whilst the state and the law provide for harshness, society prefers to not be so harsh, because a lot of the time the juries will not find guilty. Or sometimes they'll say, this person is guilty, the threshold for what they stole is 12p. So if it's above worth of 12p, it's death. But if it's below 12p, they'll say it's just, imprisonment or a fine. So what they'll do is, in one case, a man stole a silver cup, which was worth 30 shillings. So 30 shillings is way more than the 12p threshold. And what they'll say is, he's guilty of theft, but we don't believe that silver cup is worth 30 shillings. We think it's worth 11p. So literally just below the threshold for the death sentence. So what they're saying is, he's a criminal, he's guilty of a crime, we think he should be punished, but we don't want a death sentence. And that, to me, is a perfect encapsulation of a society as a whole that rejects ultimate sanction of death in an awful lot of cases. So I'll be asking questions tonight like, why? What does that tell us about Irish society? Irish society is violent. It's much more violent than today. You always hear people today who watch too much news saying, oh, society is becoming so violent. And I pull out my historical records, and I say, well, hang on a second. In Ireland, on average, in recent years, you might have a murder or homicide rate of maybe 55, 60 people. Now, that's 60 people too many, but it's during COVID, it dropped down to 20. And yet, when my grandmother's grandmother was around in the 1880s, the homicide rate was maybe 127 a year. So even though people look with nostalgia to the past as a nice time where we didn't have much money, but everybody was happy, I think probably they weren't, and everybody felt safe. People use a phrase like, you could leave your door unlocked back in the day because everybody in our neighborhood was nice and nobody would steal. I don't think that's true at all, by the way. But the murder rate 150 years ago was way higher. And in the 17th century, it's way higher again, I think. Lots of people die in violent circumstances in the 17th century. The state is a very violent state. We have martial law in Ireland when there's no war. And that means that military officers can execute people legally with no jury trial and the circumstances of such. Now, during a war, people think maybe that's acceptable. Martial law, military law is important to keep order when the courts can't function normally. But in Ireland, the war stops, military law continues for the next 40 years in the early 17th century. And we know that there is lots of violence, and the state perpetrates a lot of violence as well. Arguments for civilization and colonies civilizing the local population. So in the 19th century, people maybe in Germany or France or England saying, we're civilizing people in Africa, we're making them European, we're bringing our values, our religion, we're teaching people to eat with a knife and fork and to dress nicely and all this sort of thing. The same sort of thing has been said in Ireland in the 17th century. The English are going to civilize the Irish, but the big irony about it is that their mission to civilize, which to me is dodgy in the first place, because I think Ireland has got a perfectly good civilization as it is, but in order to civilize the people, they're going to act in a very barbaric fashion. So the death rate, the killings, the violence, all of that sort of thing, the English are themselves acting in a barbarous manner to try and show how civilized they are. It's the ultimate sort of kind of mindfuck, if you don't mind me using such a word, So the really interesting thing for me when I study criminal justice, outside of that state violence, when the community become involved, because in Ireland we have a jury system, so 12 people from the locality, usually kind of middling sorts of people who sit on juries, or at least the grand juries, the juries maybe as well, and they reject state violence. They say we have the power to kill, we're not going to use it. And that to me is a really, really interesting point, that the population, that for the civilizing project where in theory the state is trying to civilize the people say, no, thank you. We don't want that level of violence. Yes, we want to see criminals punished, people who steal horses or steal cattle, which is a very common crime in Ireland, or even people who kill. We will have ways to, so for instance, there's cases of a woman who kills her husband. And I don't know the circumstances of the killing, but she kills her husband. And then she claims that she's pregnant. She claims what's called benefit of the belly. And a jury of matrons come into the courtroom. So this is a jury of women, and they inspect her. Now, I don't know exactly how they inspect her. Maybe they touch her belly. Maybe they do something more intimate. Maybe they just look at her. But they say, yes, she's pregnant. And because she's pregnant, she can't be executed. And that's put off for a time. There's another case where a woman who, as far as I understand, is having an affair with another man. The two of them kill her husband. So that should be a case where society is very upset. That should be a case where society wants to see vengeance, where it wants to see retribution. And again, in this case, the Lord Lieutenant, the head of the state, asked the judges to write a report into the case because he's clearly reluctant to execute. So they try and draw out the process, wait a few weeks until the report comes back, take your time. The longer time that you have until somebody is executed, to me, that it's less likely that they're going to be executed as a result, So something like that. So for me, it's really interesting. It's not just about crime. It's not just about what does the law say the punishment is, or it's not just how does the court work or how does the law work. For me, and the talk I'll be giving tonight, for me, the interesting thing about studying crime is that it's a window on society. I used to be a legal historian. In many respects now, I'm actually a social historian because I'm interested in how gender works with crime. I'm interested in how class works with crime. I'm interested in how regional areas work with crime. Is there a higher death sentence or is there a higher conviction rate in certain areas? How do rural people react to criminal activity versus how do urban people, because an urban environment is very different. You're living very close together, as we are here today in a city centre. So we have to regulate our societies within the city much stronger than we do in the countryside. And I think that's still the same today. Think about how people live in very rural areas where there's very little control from the state, because the forces of the state, the police, aren't around in the country as much, whereas in the city centre, CCTV cameras everywhere, lots of police, because we need lots of regulation because we're living so closely together that there's a much greater chance that we'd see people fighting or falling out, or just you're more likely to crash into somebody's car in a city than you are in the country, probably. It's just the nature of the way that society goes. So for me, I think that there's a useful window on Irish society in the 17th century looking through crime, but particularly something like how the lower levels of Irish society work, because they don't write things in documents. So we don't have as good an insight onto the poorer people, onto the middling people, because they haven't left us records. It's easy to write the history of what we used to call great men, and occasionally great women as well when we have the time, But to look at what today we would use a phrase like working class, or people from the lower levels of society, women, homeless people. We have a lot of law around what we call vagabonds in Ireland, how Irish society changes in relation to people who move around. People who aren't tied to a farm or to a house, people who scare everybody in the town because they're outsiders who travel in for a time and then travel away for a time and don't feel like they belong. So it's just really interesting to look at somebody, at those levels on the lower levels of society, particularly, like I say, things like homeless people, vagabond law, the law of stopping movements of people who are scared, where societies are scared of these people because they're coming from outside, because they're poor. So we're essentially criminalizing poverty. It's a horrific thing. We do it in our modern societies as well. Things haven't changed, I'm sorry to say, but also the fear of things like disease. the fear of uncontrolled women, the fear of young men who are not married off, and so represent a potential for chaos within the society. So it's a really interesting window on how society views these people who are, who stay outside of what we might call normative society boundaries, and also how maybe people from those elements within those societies react to the power of the state as well. And so sometimes the criminal justice system can allow us to see these things, and it doesn't always, but it can be a brilliant window onto those elements within Irish society.
And speaking of death sentence as a very, very important category in criminal law, that category is something what divides past societies and present societies. When we hear at this time of speaking, we don't have many systems with that sentence. There are some, but overall, it is all about international law. So, what insights can the study of crime and old parliamentary law can tell us and make us better understand the social developments, both historical and contemporary? Because cancelling death penalty is some kind of result of developing law.
Yeah.
So I would like to know, what do you think about that?
It's a very interesting point. I mean, I would be, personally speaking, I'm not in favor of the death penalty. I think most people probably aren't. Occasionally, I mean, I can speak only from Irish experience. Traditionally, in the 20th century, by about the 1950s, early 1960s, we stopped the death penalty. We had not a huge number of cases. A colleague of mine, called Lindsay Black, did a brilliant book on women and the death penalty in Ireland, where we have about, I can't remember how many, I think about 20 women who are convicted. Very few are executed. The execution rate, I think, is higher for men, but again, the numbers convicted aren't always huge. And I think Irish society now is very happy that we don't have a death sentence. But it's interesting to note, when there's an outrage, traditionally, after the 1950s, 1960s, the only people that could be sentenced to death were those guilty of what today we would call treason. It's given a different term in Ireland. I think it's Offence Against the State Act, whereby if you killed a significant politician, a diplomat, or a policeman, and there have been a number of policemen who have been killed in the line of duty in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Most of the conflict took place in Northern Ireland, but it did spill into the south on occasion, and there was plenty of policemen who have been killed. And occasionally you will hear people say, when a policeman is killed, and I think a sentence for killing a policeman in Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert on this, is about 40 years, whereas most people who commit murder otherwise would serve about maybe 18, 19, 20 years today. So there's a significant greater punishment for those, because you're not just attacking the policeman, you're attacking the state as well. That, I think, is the idea behind it. But you will occasionally hear people say, maybe we should still have a death sentence for killing a policeman, because it seems like an outrage and it offends people. But I think I often wonder, so I think it's a good thing that society has moved past a death sentence, obviously. I think we need to be careful not to be too smug or not to be too self-congratulatory about the state of our criminal justice system, because whilst a death sentence, I think, is not a good thing, because we make mistakes, because I don't think it's civilized to kill other people, even when they have done terrible things, and many people have done terrible things. At the same time, putting people into prison for a very, very, very long time isn't always a perfect system either. Now, I don't have a better system to replace it with. And there's people far cleverer than you and me who have thought a very long time about this and haven't come up with a better system either. But sometimes the system of incarceration doesn't produce good results. It doesn't necessarily make society better. You know, longer sentences where politicians want to show just how angry they are to get votes, obviously, a lot of the time, and who just keep on increasing sentences higher and higher and higher, doesn't always solve problems. You know, instead of maybe having a war on crime, might we consider having a war on poverty? or a war on poor educational standards, or a war on an inclusive society that doesn't create and push people out to the margins. Because if you do that through things like homelessness and poverty or exclusion, and this can be on gender or ethnicity or other sorts of things, and if you push people away out to the margins, don't be surprised if they behave in a way that you don't like. Do you know? And so to a point, I think, this is not necessarily just purely about law, but I think studying crime in particular, whilst it's good that the death penalty is something that is hopefully resigned to the past forever, we still don't have a perfect criminal justice system, and it still needs huge thinking. I think it doesn't necessarily need huge investment, because, you can help the issues around crime in a cheaper manner than you can sometimes with alternatives to prison. Do you know? During what we used to call the Celtic Tiger in Ireland, before the economic crash, I'm not perfectly sure of these figures, but I seem to remember that the cost of incarcerating a person in an Irish prison was about 96,000 euros a year. So I don't know what that is in Serbian dinars, but it's a lot, okay? The cost of sending somebody to the most expensive private school in Ireland is about 12,000 euros a year. So that's 8 times more expensive to send somebody to prison than it is to send them to the most expensive school. There was a survey, I think it was under the Labour government in the UK, that in the 1990s or the early 2000s, I think it was Jack Straw that commissioned the survey, and the results suggested something along the lines of, again, I don't have a perfect recollection of the detail, that for every £1 that you spend on children, you can save £16 on them not going to prison 20 years later. So if you invest in things like breakfast club in school, after school help, social activities, sports clubs, things that create an inclusive society where children feel valued, where they're not pushed out to the margins, where then they don't engage in crime, that later on you save way more money. That's such an obvious investment to make. Imagine if I had a pension, whereas I put in £1 and I get 16 at the end. Everybody would want in on that pension. So you need to consider that our society still has a long way to go. And I think European society generally needs to think about those sorts of things. The problem of an inhuman, degrading criminal justice system is not gone. It's still with us. We need to think, do better. We have done lots of good things, and there's lots of progressive stuff going on across Europe. Some countries better than others, some have improvements to make, but nobody, to my mind, has the perfect situation. But continuing to incarcerate in ever-increasing sentences, to my mind, isn't a solution to those problems, I don't think, anyway. Do you know?
Yes, speaking of that, what do you think that international criminal law system lacks the most? As speaking about that international overall, not speaking of a specific country, but overall, international criminal law has some things that can be done better. So do you have any specific thing in your mind?
I'm not really. I've done a couple of modules as a student on international criminal law, but it seems that it's increasingly sort of out of date. I suppose one of the things to keep in mind right now about international criminal law is probably that it's under severe pressure as a system. Things like people threatening to take over other countries like Greenland, wars on the eastern side of Europe. I think, I'm not an international criminal lawyer. I did study it a little bit as a student. I wouldn't have a huge amount to say on it, but I suppose one of the most interesting things, and I suppose the very obvious point, most people watching will probably understand it as well, is that the system of international criminal law, in terms of bringing perpetrators to justice, it seems to me, under severe pressure, where people who have previously sort of put themselves forward, the Americans were so strong in creating things like international criminal courts, then don't engage with them themselves, don't make their own politicians or soldiers appear before courts in the unlikely event that they'd ever be prosecuted. And I say unlikely not because they don't commit crimes, but unlikely for political reasons. It's always a political form of justice to a point. Even just this week, things like what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Eastern Europe, what's going on with places like Greenland. Those things suggest that the international criminal law system is under severe pressure. That, I mean, to a point, realistically, it's always had political elements to it, which in effect then when politicians are either driving it or developing, because it's created sort of out of nothing in the last, well, not out of nothing, but there's such a fast pace to the creation of international criminal law, particularly around structures for punishing offenders, that a common law system like the one I come from has had law developing over such a long period of time, hundreds of years. In people's minds, legal theorists back in the Middle Ages or in the early modern period thought it went all the way back to the mists of time, to a time immemorial. And so you could argue that the common law is developed and reacts to a society that accepts it and that understands the need for it and that is part of it. Whereas if you take what is maybe a Western tradition of international criminal law and plant it on the world and say everybody has to abide by this now, is there that buy-in? Is there that consensus from people? I think overall the ideas behind it are good. I think they come from a positive place. But the way that the law is actually maybe played out doesn't always see satisfactory results for everybody in terms of, the philosophy of justice and all that sort of thing. Do you know?
Yes, I completely agree. I just want to make one whole story to talk also about past law system, crime law system, and present. Thank you very much. So now I would go back to your career, but current, and you have recently become the director of publications for International Commission for the History of Representative and Parliamentary Institutions, and previously you have served as co-director of Parliament, States and Representation, as well as holding roles in the Irish Legal History Society. And I would like to know how have these experiences shaped your perspective on historical legal system and influenced your research?
Yeah, I think they've been of huge benefit to me. I've really enjoyed interaction. I suppose ultimately academics, whilst there is the temptation to disappear into your study or into your office and never leave, and occasionally give a lecture to some undergraduates and then retreat back in, is that it can become a lonely profession. We work mostly by ourselves. Occasionally you'll have collaborative projects, but not all that often. And for me, there was great value interacting both with the very kind of awkwardly titled International Commission for the History of Representative Parliamentary Institutions, and we are thinking about shortening that name a little bit. Usually we just call it the Commission. And also the Irish Legal History Society, is that it gave me contact with other scholars. So most of the people in the Irish Legal History Society are either from Ireland or working in Ireland, and so it's interesting. We've got a lovely mix of academic historians, academic lawyers, legal practitioners, so barristers, senior kind of counsel people, and also judges, which is not always common in legal history societies in other parts of the world. And so access to people with very different perspectives, different sort of everything from personal life experiences to academic experiences, the people who practically work in the law, the people who work within the universities in the legal systems. It's a brilliant, brilliant way to talk, to listen, to read what people are working on. Even though they're all working in and on Ireland, some people are working on early medieval Irish legal history, other people are sitting in the Supreme Court that afternoon, sometimes handing down what could be momentous judgments. So for me, just that chance to interact, to listen and to learn from other people because sometimes where you're just talking to other historians who work in the same area that you do, it's like being in an echo chamber. You're just talking to people where you're all working on the same thing. So it's brilliant to see other things. It's like travel. You need to go and see other places and see how other people do things to really appreciate the world around you. And for the Parliamentary History Commission, for me, that's brilliant because whilst we all work on the same topic, parliamentary history for the most part, it's amazing to see. First of all, we meet once a year, usually in early September, for a conference. So I hosted one in Dublin, a good few years ago now, just over 10 years ago. We visited Spain, Norway, Czech Republic, Austria, France, Spain. I'd love to come to Serbia sometime. I don't know if anybody would take it upon themselves to organise one, but I think it would be a brilliant location. And so to go and see, and usually we visit parliaments, we might visit courts as well. We usually are hosted in a university, so we get to visit other cities, see their institutions, talk to people from. That's how I met one of your colleagues here in Belgrade in that commission, and I've got close working friends and relations with other people from lots of other different parts of the world. And it's a very good way to learn how academia can be done, because you always have the sense that, oh, the way we're doing it is fine for us in our country, and I'm not interested in any other countries. But then when I come here and I see you have a different building, or maybe lecturers work in a different way, or what is considered, like even just considering does the word medieval mean in another country, it can change, because for some people, initially probably the Renaissance or the early modern period maybe starts in potentially even the mid 1300s. Certainly by the 1400s. In Ireland, a lot of people will say that the early modern period starts in the 1530s, 100 years later. So we need to be aware that even simple words like that, which we think we know and understand, can have very different meanings, but also just understanding what words like representation means, how parliaments can work. Just assume, because we always think, in Ireland we have a system called proportional representation for elections. And people in Ireland, both academics and the public generally, have a lot of confidence in that system. They think it's a good system because it allows for representation of minorities, and it's a system that we know, we're comfortable with it, and we like it. And everybody go to somewhere like England, where they have some uses of proportional representation in some of their regional parliaments, but in the main parliament at Westminster, they have a first-past-the-post system, which isn't really as representative as it could be, but it's one that the English are comfortable with because they've been using it for centuries. They like it, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's a bad system per se, but they wouldn't like proportional representation because it's not their system, and they've thought about bringing it in and they've rejected the idea of it. So it's very interesting for someone like me to go to lots of different countries to see how different systems work, to appreciate that other systems work well, that maybe it wouldn't work well in Ireland, but it works well in Serbia, or it works well in Hungary, or it works well in Germany, or wherever else it might be, So the contact that I have with other people, the ability to visit other places and to really get in under the skin, if you understand the phrase, to get under the skin of a different system of representation, to understand maybe how politics works, how the institutions work, just to visit the physical buildings. I'm writing a piece at the moment of parliamentary history for a book. It's a co-authored piece. And when I started writing the piece, this tells us a lot about COVID times. When I started writing the piece, I'd never met the other two historians I was working with. We met online, that's it. I'd never physically met them in person. But we started writing this chapter together for a book. It's part of a much bigger project. And our chapter is on the physical space of Parliament. So we're looking at architecture. We're looking at space in a room. How does, for instance, in the English Parliament traditionally, it's based on an old chapel, St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster. So in the Latin Christian, I know here in St. Savas it's a big wide open space, but in English churches it's a long narrow space. Okay? And so if you look even at the House of Commons today in England, if you've ever seen it on TV, it's like a corridor. So it's a long narrow space. Whereas in Ireland, in our House of Commons in the 18th century, we had a large octagonal space, 8 sides, so more like a circle. So how does the oral debate and argument get affected by people who are essentially shouting up a corridor at each other, or people who are talking across a room to each other, So looking at those spaces can be very useful. How is decoration? What kind of colours is on the furniture? For instance, in Ireland, it's very rare that we have the monarch in our parliament because they don't reside in Ireland, but they do sometimes put up a picture, a portrait of the monarch. So you have to pay respect to the picture maybe, or to the coat of arms. The symbolism of things like that can be very, very interesting. In Ireland, for instance, they've got a gallery on the top of the House of Commons, and there's a very famous picture by a guy called Wheatley of the Irish House of Commons. I can send it to you later if you wish. And in the top, it's full of women. Now, traditionally, women don't appear in Parliament in Ireland until 1918. That's not to say that they're not politically aware. It's not to say that they're not politically active. It's not to say that they don't understand politics or they're not involved in politics, or that some of them don't have very strong and robust opinions on what's going on. And we can see from that painting, and we have documentary evidence otherwise, to show that they're heavily involved and they're consuming politics. They're observing the chamber. I often wonder if there's ever interaction. Are some politicians, we have a phrase in English called playing to the gallery, trying to impress the people up in the gallery, And so it's very interesting to note things like that, and you can learn an awful lot by looking at the differences and the similarities. So when you go abroad, when you interact with scholars from other parts of the world, you gain from their experience. It's a learning experience, And so for me, being involved in international organizations or organizations where I'm interacting with different professionals, it's only good comes out of it, I think.
Yes, there is always space to upgrade your knowledge.
Yeah.
And here comes my next question, which is related to this theme. So your career has been also marked by teaching across Europe. You have taught in several academical contexts, and as that you have taught at several universities across Europe. So how have these experiences influenced your approach to research and teaching within your main fields of interest?
Yeah. Again, all positive. I suppose I've taught in a number of Irish universities, and again, like I was just saying about being involved with different organisations, seeing how different institutions work, and mostly Irish universities work more or less in the same manner. It depends on the size sometimes. I suppose the nature of my work in several different Irish universities is a reflection of the academic job market as much as it is my happiness to travel around and work in different places. Generally speaking, it's been very, very good. When I was teaching in Maynooth, which is a historic university to the west of Dublin, that was founded in 1795 as a reaction to things like the French Revolution, because a lot of Irish clerical students who wanted to become priests, had been travelling to the continent. That closes, and the English government think, where they had been particularly hostile towards Catholics and seminaries in the 17th century, by the 18th century, they say, hang on, Catholic clergy could represent a bastion of conservatism within Ireland, anti-republicanism. So they fund a university. And so that's working as one of the biggest seminaries in the Western world. By the 19th century, Ireland is exporting priests all over the world. And when they had taken secular students in the 20th century, and by the time I was teaching there, the university has largely been secularized, with the exception of, I think, philosophy, theology, and sacred music. So there's still priest students, and then there's lots of regular secular students, we might call them. So occasionally I'd be teaching priests who were studying history would come into my lectures. So it was a very interesting interaction to have young men, 19, 20 years old, studying history, and I would be teaching maybe early modern history, which inevitably means I'm teaching religious history. And so it's interesting to take their take. So the diversity of student body for me is brilliant. I love it. And more recently in Ireland, for instance, Ireland was largely, I would say, fairly monocultural for most of the 20th century. But then, for instance, in the early 20th century, we have a lot of people from parts of Eastern Europe, including the Balkans. That's bringing diversity, and it's interesting to listen to them, to their experiences and things. And lots of people say, for example, from the Far East or from Western Africa, which again is bringing different experiences, different ideas. And so that diversity of student body is really interesting to me. So that's very interesting. When I went abroad then, I worked in University College London for 2 years. And I taught for a time at the University of Vienna after that. Two very different universities. University of Vienna, I always found Vienna a kind of a fairly conservative sort of a city. And the student body, the lawyers, I think reasonably, they seem to me a little bit more conservative. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not a negative. Just it seemed a little bit different from what I was used to in Ireland. Just the kind of thing that people would dress up on a Sunday, for example, whereas in Ireland they tend not to. So it was really interesting teaching. I taught medieval English legal history in Vienna. The students were quite interested, even though they didn't necessarily study a huge amount of of common law tradition. They knew a little bit about it, but they were enthusiastic. We used to teach 3-hour lectures there. So my teaching responsibility was that module. And I taught, I think, 3 hours on usually a Wednesday morning, 9 to 12. And that was exhausting as a teacher because you're performing. When you're teaching, it's almost like coming off the stage in a theatre. You're kind of buzzing a little bit after a lecture, but it's a long 3 hours, so it's exhausting in many respects. And you need to be mentally really, really kind of ready for it. And you're quite tired afterwards. But I think it was a very interesting perspective. The academics, the University of Vienna is very big. The law school is very big. They have a department of legal history that has, I think, maybe 6 or 8 academics plus postgraduate students. And then they also have a department, I think, of antique law or Roman law, maybe. So they've got 2 that are concerned with the history of law, whereas most Irish universities might have 1 or 2 lawyers who are interested in legal history. So in Ireland, it's not defined as a specific genre that must be taught within a university. If somebody's interested, they can teach it, but some universities, I think, potentially don't teach any legal history, or not much anyway. So Vienna was very good in that they had ring-fenced legal history as a specific area that has its own department, and that's the value of size, because it's a big law school. You have a big law school here as well, compared to others in Ireland that I've worked in. So that's a very interesting way to organise a department that can guarantee. And the idea of teaching legal history, my colleague Professor Nina was telling me that legal history is a first-year subject here, and it's an obligatory subject. So in Ireland, it's generally 3rd or 4th year, where if somebody is interested, they will take it, but it's not obligatory at all. And so that's really interesting to my mind. It's a very interesting take on that. When I went to London, when I was in London, it was like living in Disneyland for historians, because the location of University College London is in the heart of the academic district of the city. So the university is beside Birkbeck University. It's not too far from King's College, London, and it's very close to both the British Library, which is the copyright library, the main library, which was, I think, about 10 minutes walk, 15 minutes walk from my office, and also the Institute of Historical Research, which is a kind of an umbrella organisation that welcomes historians from all universities in the UK and outside the UK as well. And so at the Institute of Historical Research, there was always seminars every night. You can go online and watch them. They have maybe 20 or 30 different seminars, and they all meet once every 2 weeks. So on a Monday, there maybe be 4 seminars, Tuesday 4. So there was always something to see. And it was interesting just to have the access to the seminars. And now I know we can go online and look at seminars, but there's something lovely about being in the room. And there's a social aspect afterwards. Everybody goes for a drink afterwards, maybe. And sometimes that's just fun to go drinking, but you learn a lot. You make contacts with people. I have published 4 kind of significant books in my time as an academic, and I have others in the pipeline. They all began life, maybe I shouldn't be saying this out loud, they all began life in a pub, where I'm having a drink with somebody and you kind of say, God, isn't it weird that nobody's ever written a book on this? And so then 2 days later you get a text saying, why don't we write a book on this? We were talking about it in the pub. And I did, with colleagues, collaborative projects. So the ability to meet people, to talk to people, to listen to people, either in a formal academic environment, but then the informal, what happens afterwards, to my mind, is part of the process as well. Because sometimes where you're relaxed and you can be more informal, you can ask people questions, you can say what you're thinking. Maybe that we don't always like to speak up in a classroom. Do you know? I was an undergraduate once. In Ireland, our students are notoriously quiet in the classrooms, that they may not ask many questions in the classroom, but afterwards they may have very strong ideas, and maybe it's the same here. And so it's really good. Yeah, but it's a great way, that informal seminar afterwards, which relocates maybe to a cafe or a bar, allows people to interact, and sometimes they can be very productive. And so it's the same working with, say, for instance, getting involved with the Parliamentary History Commission. The social side of it allows people to interact, and it's very healthy, I think.
Yes, and connections are very important. So, speaking of lecturing, your lecture today here at the faculty at Forum Romanum focuses on the attrition rate in Irish criminal justice trials and why executions were relatively rare in early modern common law country as Ireland. Speaking of that, how does this research reshape our, as visitors, understanding of early modern criminal justice?
Yeah, I suppose I use the word attrition. This is coming off an article that I've written. It's not yet published. I'm hoping it will be published in the coming months. And the word attrition, the editor asked me, are we sure about attrition, that word? And it's kind of got two meanings, I suppose. Attrition rate, in part, is around the amount of people being killed, the conventional understanding of the word attrition. But also in some criminology circles, we use the word attrition rate around cases. So it's used particularly in cases. My lecture this evening isn't specifically about rapes or sexual assaults, but in Ireland in cases, because there's a very high attrition rate in those cases where a case may start or a complaint is made, but it doesn't come to fruition for a whole host of reasons. It's something specific to those sorts of crimes because the success of the case is never, the percentages are very low for conviction. So that word attrition is used both in the sense of executing criminals in the 17th century, but also the number of trials that fail. That word attrition is around the trial, but also the failure. And so the talk tonight is going to set up a premise that Ireland is a colonised country. I don't think anybody will argue with that. Although sometimes in the modern world, people find it difficult to use the word colonising around one European country with another European country. But in the Balkans, I'm sure you could use it. I don't know if you do, but it certainly could be used in those contexts with people invading from other parts. Certainly in Ireland, we use it as well. Colonised country, the forcing of one legal tradition onto another, that a kind of a distinctive indigenous Irish legal system, which is a sophisticated system, but it's not thought of as a civilized system in the 17th century, is put out, and the English system is essentially placed on, along with other issues around religion and societal norms generally, around dress and language and things like that. And that ultimately, I'm looking at why we have a system that in theory, in legal theory, and I'll bring out a legal book that has a long list of punishments, and it's death, 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 death for huge amounts of crimes, yet the practical application of the law in Irish society, which is a mixture of Irish people, indigenous Irish people, English people, and also Scottish people, that ultimately all of those societies tend to reject the death sentence. Now, people are executed on some occasions, but most of the time, when it's possible, they are not. So what I'll be asking the question is, traditionally, I would normally teach that a successful legal system is one whereby the people consent to law. That if the community doesn't buy into the legal system, it won't work very well. So they have to accept judgments from courts about who owns what property, or society generally has to accept punishment for individuals. And if the punishment is seen as too harsh, society won't accept it. And that criminal law, like all other forms of law, work when the society generally can agree this is good behaviour and we accept it, this is poor behaviour and we won't accept this. So the people who steal and murder and are violent and things like that must be rejected, and that they must be punished for their transgressions of what is normative behaviour. And this idea of normative behaviour is really important, because what's normal to an Irish person may not be considered normal to an English person, and how you behave. And what's considered good and decent behaviour to one class of society may not be considered good and decent behaviour to another. So to a point, you need consensus in society as to what is good or bad behaviour. But in a colonising society, it's very hard to find consensus, because English people will say one thing is civilising, Irish people may consider something else to be civilised behaviour. So the paper is trying to understand, where does Ireland at this moment, when law is being forced onto the majority of the population, which is essentially is a foreign law to an extent, how do they adapt to that law, and does Irish society as a whole accept it? And to my mind, the execution rate suggests in this instance they don't accept it, because there's an Irish tradition of their indigenous law system is largely a system of what we would call in the common law system torts. I don't know if you use the terminology in the legal system here in Serbia. And a tort is essentially when you sue somebody for a harm that's been done to you. So, if somebody crashes into your car, you maybe have to go to court to get recompense to pay for the damage on the car. The Irish system works the same way in that when somebody does you a harm, you get a payment in result. So there's very little violence from this. The state doesn't really exist in Ireland, more a series of petty, small kingdoms, but the legal system is comprehensive across the island in the Middle Ages. And what that means is that the state doesn't punish people in the way it does in a common law system. That what happens is you essentially bring your case before judges and they award compensation. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a good system or a bad system, because in a modern age, I think we'd all be horrified if you could just compensate somebody after you killed their father, or compensate somebody if you committed some violence against somebody. But the positive system is that we don't execute people who commit crimes in that Brehon law system in Ireland. For the most part, there's no corporal or capital punishment. It's all fines, it's all financial. So it takes the violence out of the system for the most part, but it does replace it just with money. And if you're wealthy, you can essentially buy out of a punishment, So it's not, like I say, it wouldn't work in today's society perhaps, but there are elements of it which you can say, what's so civilized about a system that executes everybody? From a 21st century perspective, it's hard to say that represents civilized behavior. Because as we were saying earlier, death sentences are not considered a civilized way to progress anymore.
Absolutely, but there are cases. So we can say that there is something that is common for both common law system and European system, even if they are completely different. And my last question, and also my favorite, since most of our students, generally speaking, but also here in Serbia, are after they're finishing their studies, are pursuing criminal law or commercial law career. And as you said, legal history isn't always obligatory.
Mm-hmm.
Here it is not the case, but speaking generally. So my question is, what advice would you give to young law students on why engaging with legal history is important for their careers and not developing just as students, but also later in life as professionals in the area of law?
Yeah, I can't say specifically how, well, particularly say in Serbia, where obviously I'm not an expert in Serbian law, that you can make a successful career in the law, obviously, without having a perfect knowledge of legal history. I know that people who study legal history bring a certain sort of roundedness to their knowledge of the law to really understand where, I would say this with history in general, to understand where we are, we need to know where we've come from. And we need to have an understanding how society develops. I would always say to my students, this sounds terribly arrogant, but I would say to students that historians, and I include legal historians in this number, have 20/20 vision, because we've already seen everything that's happened. There's nothing that hasn't happened in the past that isn't happening today. So to understand the world around us, the politics of Russia or America or China or everywhere else, when we've studied all the things that have happened in the past, we can't say we're surprised by things that are happening today, because human past is so complete in so many ways. And so from a legal history perspective, when you're going close in on the law, we can see how the law has developed over longer periods of time. So we can see the big trends that are emerging. And so if you want to understand the law now, and particularly the law as it's developing into the immediate future, legal history can give you a sense of having a little bit of, it's kind of like the ability to look into a crystal ball and to see how things are developing. And so just to have a greater understanding and not being surprised by developments in today's world, because we've seen those trends and we have an understanding. I know that sounds a bit abstract, but I do think there's practical benefit to it, to understand, to really understand the law. I think you need to understand where it's come from. Do you know?
Absolutely, I absolutely agree, because we talked about many themes, about structure of parliament, and we learn all that here in faculty. So I really wanted to know, because I think that legal history should be more popular, and I think sometimes it's underrated. So
Yeah. I mean, I would say in Ireland in recent years, we've seen surges of popularity. It's something, I think it's the course, it used to be seen as a sort of a free hit, in that in a lot of law schools, you have obligatory modules on, contract law, European law, criminal law, constitutional law, all of the things that you have to go into the professions in the law. And then you get some interesting things that you can study if you like. But we've increasingly seen numbers rising in legal history. And the fact that a lot of the significant sort of academic lawyers and significant academic practitioners are very interested in the law. We've got a number of very senior judges in Ireland that are active legal historians. They write legal history. They're not just coming along to listen politely to the paper and have a coffee afterwards. They're actually writing books on legal history. It's fascinating. And sometimes they have time, because cases are held off or there's time to spare, and they write a little bit of history. But we've got great support from particularly the senior judges within the profession, who are not just attending our meetings out of a sense of, some sort of sense of professional obligation. I think they are actually fundamentally very interested in legal history. So I think that's a lesson for everybody, that if the senior academics and the senior legal professionals are engaging in legal history, I think it's a good sign that we probably all should be,
So, as speaking of this, I have one more question which got at my mind right now. Let's in your free time, outside your job as a professional legal historian, do you have any areas of history? What would you like to read at your free time for your own satisfaction? For example, Roman law, Ottoman Empire, for example.
Yeah. God, just right now I'm reading a lot of, what am I reading at the moment? I'm reading a lot of theology at the moment. Right now I'm reading a recently published book on organised religion and sexuality by a guy called Diarmuid McCullough, who's a professor of church history in, I think it's Oxford or Cambridge. And he writes a lovely style. It's very readable. I think the real test of a great historical writer is somebody who's a really sharp academic, knows all the little details, but can actually write in a way that's easily read by people who are not professional historians or not professional lawyers. So I think that book is good for that reason, in that it's very easy to consume. So I found myself reading a lot of early church history, kind of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century histories of the church, in the East, in places like Greece and modern day Turkey and places like that. And it's quite interesting. I've also been, I read around things like church courts. It's not something I'm teaching that's legal history, I suppose, really. What else have I been reading recently? I've read a book recently on the history of jokes, which I found very, very interesting. It's just fun, but I often find, particularly if I'm teaching a double lecture, if I'm teaching a 2-hour lecture, I give little spaces in my teaching. So the theory of teaching is that students have a certain limited space in their head for concentration. They zone out. So if you break up your class, and increasingly, because we're always on phones and iPads, our concentration is even less. So you break up your teaching sometimes with little stories, little vignettes, mostly about history. But sometimes if I'm teaching an intense topic, I'll just take a tiny break and say, interesting story related to what I've just said. Did you know, blah, 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 blah. And it just gives the students a little rest. And then, so it might be just 30 seconds, and then we go back into the lecture. So sometimes where you're broadly read, if you can find things, like I say, something like the history of jokes. There was a guy in England who wrote a history of farting, which I found fascinating, and it's funny, and it's interesting, and it's a social convention, and there's a whole around societal expectations around what is good behavior, and something that can seem very vulgar, and maybe even saying it makes me vulgar in the process, but it's a very important. It's like, 100 years ago, people would not write on the history of sex. And now everybody writes the history of sex. People have no interest in the history of gender. Everybody writes on the history of gender now, And so I suppose reading about the past, a comprehensive look into areas that have traditionally been considered vulgar or inappropriate or things like that, I find interesting. That's why I was interested in those church courts originally, because they dealt with people who misbehaved. And it's probably also why I found working on the criminology of law relating to prostitution as interesting, because again, it's people who reject normal behavior, civilized behavior. But then again, like I say, the criminal law is always about people who are transgressing norms. Do you know? Because people are only confronted with... But in effect, we're all criminals. Who can say they're not a criminal? We've all broken the law. Do you know? Yeah. And for most of us, they're only small things. Thankfully, most of us aren't murderers. But nobody can say they're not a criminal, I think. So it's all about us to a point, you know?
I didn't think about it in that way, but it's an interesting perspective. I never thought of it in that way. So thank you very much for your answers. It was my pleasure once again to have you here. And I'm really sure that our readers and listeners, because of the different format, will have the opportunity to learn a lot from you, because we really talked about very interesting and popular themes. So once again, thank you for being my guest.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, good. Great. Well, thank you for that. That was great fun. I really enjoyed it.